Could you take a step back? And I apologize if it's a ridiculous question, but what is suffering? If you were try to define what suffering is, how would you go about it?
Suffering is a conscious state. There can be no suffering for a being who is completely unconscious. And it's distinguished from other conscious states in terms of being one that, considered just in itself, we would rather be without. It's a conscious state that we want to stop if we're experiencing, or we want to avoid having again if we've experienced it in the past. And that's, as I say, emphasized for its own sake, because of course people will say, well, suffering strengthens the spirit, it has good consequences. And sometimes it does have those consequences. And of course, sometimes we might undergo suffering. We set ourselves a challenge to run a marathon or climb a mountain, or even just to go to the dentist so that the toothache doesn't get worse, even though we know the dentist is going to hurt us to some extent. So I'm not saying that we never choose suffering, but I am saying that other things being equal, we would rather not be in that state of consciousness.
Is the ultimate goal sort of, you have the new 10-year anniversary release of the Life You Can Save book, really influential book. We'll talk about it a bunch of times throughout this conversation, but do you think it's possible to eradicate suffering, or is that the goal? Or do we want to achieve a kind of minimum threshold of suffering and then keeping a little drop of poison to keep things interesting in the world?
In practice, I don't think we ever will eliminate suffering. So I think that little drop of poison, as you put it, or if you like, the contrasting dash of an unpleasant color, perhaps something like that, in a otherwise harmonious and beautiful composition, that is going to always be there. If you ask me whether, in theory, if we could get rid of it, we should, I think the answer is whether, in fact, we would be better off, or whether, in terms of by eliminating the suffering, we would also eliminate some of the highs, the positive highs. And if that's so, then we might be prepared to say it's worth having a minimum of suffering in order to have the best possible experiences as well.
Is there a relative aspect to suffering? So when you talk about eradicating poverty in the world, is this the more you succeed, the more the bar of what defines poverty raises? Or is there, at the basic human ethical level, a bar that's absolute, that once you get above it, then we can morally converge to feeling like we have eradicated poverty?
I think they're both, and I think this is true for poverty as well as suffering. There's an objective level of suffering or of poverty where we're talking about objective indicators like you're constantly hungry, you can't get enough food, you're constantly cold, you can't get warm, you have some physical pains that you're never rid of. I think those things are objective. But it may also be true that if you do get rid of that and you get to the stage where all of those basic needs have been met, there may still be then new forms of suffering that develop. And perhaps that's what we're seeing in the affluent societies we have, that people get bored, for example. They don't need to spend so many hours a day earning money to get enough to eat and shelter. So now they're bored. They lack a sense of purpose. That can happen. And that then is a kind of a relative suffering that is distinct from the objective forms of suffering.
But in your focus on eradicating suffering, you don't think about that kind of the kind of interesting challenges and suffering that emerges in affluent societies. That's just not in your ethical, philosophical brain. Is that of interest at all?
It would be of interest to me if we had eliminated all of the objective forms of suffering, which I think of as generally more severe and also perhaps easier at this stage anyway to know how to eliminate. So yes, in some future state when we've eliminated those objective forms of suffering, I would be interested in trying to eliminate the relative forms as well. But that's not a practical need for me at the moment.
Sorry to linger on it because you kind of said it, but just to, is elimination the goal for the affluent society? So is there do you see suffering as a creative force?
Suffering can be a creative force. I think I'm repeating what I said about the highs and whether we need some of the lows to experience the highs.
Yeah.
So it may be that suffering makes us more creative and we regard that as worthwhile. Maybe that brings some of those highs with it that we would not have had if we'd had no suffering. I don't really know. Many people have suggested that, and I certainly have no basis for denying it. And if it's true, then I would not want to eliminate suffering completely.
But the focus is on the absolute, not to be cold, not to be hungry.
Yes, that's at the present stage of where the world's population is. That's the focus.